The mist in New Orleans didn't just roll in from the Mississippi. It seeped up from the cobblestones themselves, clinging to the wrought iron balconies of the French Quarter like ghostly lace. It was a cold, damp night, and the air carried the competing scents of stale beer, sweet breezed jasmine, and the river's ancient mud. Ilara felt the chill deep in her bones, a dampness that her thin coat couldn't repel. Her fingers, though, were what she worried about. They were stiffening, the tips numb as she tried to draw the bow across the strings of her violin. She was playing a somber, aching piece by Smetana, one that spoke of lost homelands and deep sorrow. It matched the ache in her own chest. Her audience was sparse. A few tourists huddled outside a rowdy bar, a lonely-looking man nursing a drink on a balcony, and her entire world, her 6-year-old daughter, Lyra. Lyra sat on Ilara's upturned violin case, her small body wrapped in a coat that was 2 sizes too big, a hand-me-down from a church charity box. She wasn't shivering. She was preternaturally still, her wide, dark eyes fixed on her mother's hands, watching the music being born. She was always quiet, always patient. Too patient for a child. It was a patience born of necessity, and it broke Ilara's heart every single day. The final note of the piece hung in the damp air for a moment, then vanished, swallowed by a burst of laughter from the bar next door. A few coins, mostly quarters, 1 crumpled dollar bill, landed in the open velvet lining of her case. Ilara offered a tired smile that didn't reach her eyes, bowing her head in thanks. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. Time to go home. "My love," Ilara whispered, her voice rough. She carefully wiped down her violin, her last and only treasure from a life before this, and settled it into the case. Lyra hopped off, grabbing the edge of her mother's coat, her small hand a warm anchor in the cold night. They walked, not towards their tiny, drafty apartment just outside the quarter, but in the opposite direction. It was a small detour, a nightly ritual that Lyra silently insisted upon. Their path took them past the glowing, warm windows of restaurants they could never enter, and shops filled with glittering Mardi Gras masks they would never wear. Ilara's stomach grumbled, reminding her that the half loaf of bread and jar of peanut butter at home would have to stretch. Her wallet held $12. 12 crumpled dollars against the world. Then they stopped. It was always this window, not a bright, cheerful toy store, but a dark, imposing antique shop. The sign above, Rousseau's Curiosities, was written in faded gold leaf. The shop was closed, a single amber light illuminating its contents, making the place look less like a store and more like a museum for forgotten things. Lyra pressed her nose against the cold glass, a small puff of white fog obscuring her reflection. Her eyes were glued to one object, and one object only. It wasn't a Barbie. It was a porcelain doll, nestled on a bed of faded black velvet. She was Victorian, with delicate, hand-painted rosy cheeks, startlingly intelligent glass-blue eyes, and real auburn curls tucked under a lace bonnet. Her dress was a cascade of cream-colored silk and tiny seed pearls. She was exquisite. She was a relic. And she was, to Lyra, the most beautiful thing in the world. Lyra had been talking about the doll for months, ever since they first saw her. Not with the demanding whine of most children, but with a quiet, reverent awe. She'd named her Serafina. "She looks lonely, Mama," Lyra whispered, her tiny hand tracing the doll's outline on the glass. "I think she wants a friend." Ilara knelt, pulling Lyra's coat tighter around her small frame. She felt the familiar hot sting behind her eyes, the burn of failure and a love so fierce it was physically painful. She swallowed hard, forcing the tears back. Crying wouldn't pay the rent. Crying wouldn't fill their bellies. sweetheart." Ilara's voice trembled, a whisper just for the two of them. "She is so beautiful. But I can't. I can't afford her, my love. Not this time." Lyra didn't cry. She just leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her gaze fixed on the doll. "Maybe one day, Mama," she said, her voice impossibly small. "Maybe one day we'll have enough." "Yes, my love," Ilara whispered back, kissing the top of her daughter's hair, which smelled faintly of soap and the city air. "Maybe one day." She stood, gently pulling Lyra away from the window. "But you know what? You are my princess. You are more beautiful and more precious than all the dolls in the whole world." Lyra gave a small, wobbly smile and tucked her hand back into Ilara's. They turned to leave, just two small figures disappearing into the swirling fog. They never saw the man watching them. He stood across the street, motionless in the deep shadow of a Garden District carriage house, untouched by the flickering gaslight. He was tall, dressed not in an expensive suit, but in the timeless elegance of old money, a perfectly tailored black coat that seemed to drink the light, a stark white shirt, and hands that were unnervingly still. His name was Lord Cassian, and he was, to the very few who truly knew, the master of the shadows they walked in. He had been having a rough century. He was bored. Weaker, lesser vampires concerned themselves with petty power squabbles and the crass accumulation of wealth. Cassian had wealth. He had power. He had eternity. And it was all a suffocating, gray, repetitive noise. He hadn't been watching the mother and child. He had been listening. He had heard the violin. Through the din of traffic, the drunken shouts, and the tinny thrum of jazz, her music had sliced through the night. It was pure, unadulterated feeling. It was grief, and loss, and a desperate, clinging hope. It was everything he had spent centuries forgetting. He had watched her play, her eyes closed, her soul pouring into the instrument. He had watched the child, a silent sentinel guarding her mother's meager earnings. And then he had watched the scene at the window. He saw the mother's reflection in the glass, the exhaustion, the struggle, the love wrapped in worry. He heard the trembling whisper, "I can't afford her." He saw the child's quiet acceptance, a resignation no 6-year-old should possess. A different man, a mortal man like the CEO in a storybook, might have felt pity. Cassian felt something else. He felt a jolt, a sharp, cold curiosity. This was humanity. Not the greedy, loud, selfish kind he dealt with daily, but the raw, sacrificial, beautiful kind. The mother's love was a thing of such purity, it was almost luminous in the dark, grimy street. It was a light, and he was a creature of darkness, starved for it. Ilara's words to her daughter, "You are my princess," hit him harder than any physical blow. He didn't move for a long moment after they left. Then he made a slight, imperceptible gesture with one pale hand. A figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alley. A man in a simple, dark suit, who seemed to have no face, no features of any note. He bowed his head to Cassian, awaiting orders without a word. Cassian didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on the porcelain doll in the window. "The shop." Cassian's voice was quiet, a smooth, cultured baritone that sounded like crushed velvet and old tombs. "Wake the owner. Buy the doll. Find out where they live." The man in the suit simply nodded, then vanished. Cassian turned, melting back into the shadows from which he'd come, the faint, aching melody of the violin still echoing in his ancient mind. The tiny apartment was cold. Ilara lit the stove's gas burner for a few minutes, a wasteful and dangerous habit, just to take the Arctic chill out of the air before she and Lyra huddled under their shared nest of blankets on the mattress in the corner. They ate their peanut butter on stale bread, and Ilara lit the single chipped candle on their table, a stack of old newspapers. "Happy birthday, my little bird," Ilara whispered, pulling a small, clumsily carved wooden bird from her pocket. She'd spent a week whittling it in secret. Lyra's face lit up with genuine joy, a radiance that eclipsed the doll in the window. "A nightingale! Oh, Mama, he's perfect." She hugged the bird tightly, then her mother. Ilara held her daughter, breathing in her scent, and fought the familiar panic that threatened to rise in her throat. The rent was due in 3 days. She was short. She didn't know what she was going to do. A sharp, sudden knock echoed through the small room. Ilara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It was past 10 o'clock. No one ever came to their door. She instinctively pulled Lyra behind her, her hand reaching for the only weapon she had, a thick, metal-handled kitchen knife on the counter. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just silence. Then another knock, louder this time, firmer. "Please," Ilara whispered, "we don't have any money." Silence. Ilara waited, her breath held for a full minute. She crept to the door, peered through the peephole. It was warped and cracked, but she could see the hallway. It was empty. Frowning, she unlatched the deadbolt, opening the door just a crack, the knife still held tight in her other hand. Nothing. No one. She looked down. A box sat on their welcome mat. It wasn't a cardboard box. It was a magnificent dark mahogany case, bound with tarnished brass. It looked ancient, expensive, and completely out of place on her threadbare strewn floor. Her heart pounding with a new, different kind of fear. Ilara slowly pulled the box inside and shut the door, latching the bolt. "What is it, Mama?" Lyra asked, peeking out from behind the mattress. I don't know." Ilara stared at the box. It had no note, no card, no return address. She nudged it with her foot. It was heavy. Finally, her curiosity overwhelming her fear, she knelt and unlatched the brass clasps. The lid opened with a soft whoosh. Inside, nestled on a bed of rich black velvet, was the porcelain doll. Ilara gasped, stumbling backward. Lyra crept forward, her eyes as wide as saucers. "Serafina," Lyra breathed, her hand reaching out but not daring to touch. "Mama, it's her. She found us." Ilara's mind was racing. "How? Who?" She ran back to the door, flinging it open. The hallway was empty. The street outside was silent, save for the distant wail of a saxophone. She shut the door, her hands trembling. This wasn't a kindness. This was a message. Someone had watched them. Someone had followed them. Someone knew where they lived. Lyra, however, felt no such fear. She carefully, reverently, lifted the doll from the box. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, her face glowing with a joy so pure it was heartbreaking. "She's even more beautiful up close." Ilara could only nod, her throat tight with a confusing mix of gratitude and terror. As Lyra hugged the doll, Ilara looked back into the empty box. Lying on the black velvet, almost invisible, was one more thing. It wasn't a note. It was a single rose. It was perfect, the petals a deep, impossible crimson that was almost black. It had no thorns. Ilara picked it up. The petals were cold, like marble, but silky smooth. She watched, horrified, as a single tear she hadn't realized she'd shed fell onto the flower. The drop of water didn't roll off. It simply vanished. Absorbed. She clutched the cold rose, her gaze moving from her joyous, laughing daughter to the dark, empty hallway beyond their door. For the first time in a long time, it wasn't the lack of money that terrified her. It was the sudden, inexplicable gift of it. The porcelain doll, Serafina, sat on the chipped windowsill, her glass-blue eyes staring out at the alley. She was a queen presiding over a kingdom of cracked pavement. For Lyra, she was a miracle. For Ilara, a terrifying, unanswered question. Beside her, the black rose sat in a cracked water glass. Days had passed, but it had not wilted. Its petals remained as firm, cold, and perfect as the moment it arrived. A beautiful, impossible thing that defied the decay of their world. But reality, sharp and mundane, quickly returned. The rent, a looming, faceless monster, was due. The handful of dollars in Ilara's wallet had vanished. Mr. Petrov, their landlord, had knocked that morning, his face a mask of annoyed pity. "One more day, Ilara," he'd said, his voice firm. "I have my own bills." She knew. She'd spent the entire day walking, violin case in hand, from one restaurant to another. Not to play, but to beg for a job. Washing dishes, sweeping floors, anything. The answers were all the same. "We're not hiring. We're cutting back." "Sorry." That evening, Ilara sat on the mattress, her violin limp in her lap. She couldn't even play. Lyra was asleep. Serafina clutched tight in her arms, her breathing the only peaceful sound in the cold room. The terror Ilara felt was no longer of the unknown, but of the known. The street. The shelters. She was packing a small, desperate go bag with their essentials, a change of clothes, their toothbrushes, Lyra's nightingale, when she saw it. A pale, cream-colored envelope had been slid silently under their door. It hadn't been there an hour ago. She approached it as if it were a snake. Her name was written on the front, in a strong, elegant script that was both beautiful and severe. Ilara Vance. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. The card inside was thick, expensive, and cold to the touch. It was not a note. It was a job offer. Your talents are requested. A private collector requires an expert for the restoration and cataloging of a significant collection of rare manuscripts and stringed instruments. The work is delicate and requires a musician's hand and an artist's eye. Lodging and all accommodations for yourself and your daughter will be provided. The weekly stipend is $5,000. Ilara read the last sentence 3 times. Her vision blurred. $5,000. A week. It was a fantasy, a typing error. It was more than she had made in the last 2 years. She turned the card. At the bottom, a simple typed line. "A carriage will await you at the corner of Bourbon and St. Anne tomorrow at dusk. If you accept, be there." This was not a job offer. It was a summons, a test. She looked from the impossible card to the impossible rose on her windowsill. They were connected. She knew it with a certainty that settled cold in her stomach. The same person who had bought a doll worth hundreds of dollars was now offering her a salary worth thousands. The fear she'd felt at the doll's arrival was nothing compared to this. The doll was a gift. This was a transaction. This was a price. For what? "What do you want?" she whispered to the empty room, to the cold rose. The room offered no answer but the wail of a distant siren. Ilara looked at Lyra, her small face so peaceful in sleep, oblivious to the fact that their world was ending. This offer, this absurd, terrifying, impossible offer. Was it a trap? Or was it the only lifeline they had? The fear of the unknown was immense, but the fear of tomorrow, of Mr. Petrov's final knock, of taking her child to a homeless shelter, that fear was greater. "I will protect you," she whispered, kissing Lyra's forehead. "I will do anything." The next day, as the sun bled into the horizon, staining the New Orleans sky a deep bruised purple, Ilara stood at the corner of Bourbon and St. Anne. She held her violin case in one hand and Lyra's small, warm hand in the other. Lyra was clutching Serafina. They had brought only what they could carry. "Are we going on an adventure, Mama?" Lyra asked, her voice small against the growing noise of the evening. "Yes, my love," Alara said, forcing a smile. "A new adventure." Right as the last sliver of sun vanished, a car pulled up to the curb. It was a sleek black vintage Rolls-Royce, so quiet it seemed to have appeared from the fog itself. The windows were tinted so darkly they looked like polished obsidian. A man in a simple, dark suit emerged from the driver's side. It was the same man she'd seen in the alley. She was sure of it. The same forgettable face, the same aura of complete, unsettling stillness. He opened the back door without a word. "In," he said. His voice was flat, without accent. Ilara's heart was a bird beating against her ribs. This was it. The moment of no return. She picked up Lyra, held her tight, and got into the car. The seats were soft, black leather, and the inside smelled faintly of old books and ozone. The door shut with a heavy, final thud. The car glided through the French Quarter and turned onto St. Charles Avenue, leaving the bright, cheerful lights for the Garden District. Here, the mansions loomed like dark palaces set back from the road, hidden behind ancient moss-draped oaks and high wrought-iron fences. The car slowed, turned, and passed through a gate so massive it looked like it belonged to a fortress. The gate closed behind them with a low, hydraulic sigh. They drove up a long, winding path, the oaks so thick they blotted out the sky. The mansion was a 3-story Creole masterpiece, with towering white columns, dark green shutters, and a wraparound gallery. But it was wrong. There were no lights in the windows. The gardens, while not overgrown, were unnaturally still. No insects, no frogs. A perfect, silent, dead beauty. The faceless man, Malachy, opened her door. "Follow me." Alara and Lyra stepped out. The air was cold and still. The house loomed over them. Malachy led them up the grand steps to a pair of massive oak doors and pushed them open. The foyer was vast, dark, and cold. A single dim chandelier cast more shadows than light. "Wait here!" Malachy vanished into the shadows of a long hallway. "Mama, I'm scared," Lyra whispered, burying her face in Ilara's neck. "It's okay, my love. It's just a big old house." Ilara's voice was shaking. This place felt empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of life. "It's not empty!" The voice came from the darkness at the top of a sweeping grand staircase. Alara jumped, pulling Lyra closer. A figure descended. He moved with a liquid, unnerving grace. He was tall, dressed in a simple modern black shirt and dark trousers, yet he seemed to belong to another time. As he stepped into the dim light of the chandelier, Ilara saw him clearly. It was the man from the alley, the man who had watched them at the window. He was pale, his skin like alabaster, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His hair was jet black, swept back from his brow. He was beautiful in a way that was almost painful, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, dark, impossible color, and they held a sadness so profound, so ancient, it seemed to swallow the light. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was the one from her memory, like velvet and old tombs. "I am Cassian. Welcome to my home." "You," Ilara swallowed, her throat dry. "You're the one. The doll. The card." "I am," he said. He made no apology. His eyes moved from Ilara to the child in her arms. "And this must be Lyra." Lyra, to Ilara's shock, peeked out. She just stared. Cassian's severe face softened by an almost imperceptible degree. "A beautiful name? For a brave girl?" "Hello," Lyra whispered. "You have sad eyes." Ilara's heart stopped. "Lyra, darling, don't be rude." "She is not rude," Cassian said, his voice quiet. She is observant. He held his gaze on Lyra for a moment. You must be tired. Malachi will show you to your rooms. We can discuss the collection tomorrow night. Tomorrow night. Malachi reappeared and led them to a suite larger than their entire apartment, with a fireplace and a soft, canopied bed. The work began the following evening. Malachi led Ilara to the library, leaving Lyra playing happily by the fire. The library was the most beautiful room Ilara had ever seen. 2 stories, an entire wing of the house, filled floor to ceiling with books and instruments under a massive skylight that showed only the black, empty sky. Cassian was there, standing by a rare 17th-century Amati violin. This, he said without turning, was last played for the Sun King. It has been silent for 300 years. It's magnificent, Ilara breathed. The work is this, he said, gesturing to the room. Many of these books are unbound. Many of these instruments are damaged by time. They need a delicate hand. A hand that understands them. Your hand. He finally turned to her. You were a student at the conservatory in Vienna, were you not? Before your husband left you. Before New Orleans. Ilara froze. How could you possibly know that? I am a collector, Miss Vance. I do my research. His voice was smooth, but it held a warning. The job is simple. You will restore, and you will talk to me. I find the silence repetitive. Tell me about the world outside. Tell me what your music means. And so began the strangest routine of Ilara's life. Every evening, as dusk fell, she would go to the library. Malachi would bring a tray of delicious hot food for her and Lyra. But Ilara never saw Cassian or Malachi eat. Not once. She would work, her skilled hands carefully rebinding a 16th-century book, or painstakingly restringing a cello. And Cassian would sit, watching. At first she was terrified, but he was brilliant. His knowledge was staggering. He'd quote Roman poetry and debate Paganini as if he'd heard the composer himself. She, in turn, found herself talking. Really talking. She told him about her music, her dreams, her loss. He listened. He never judged. He just absorbed. You are so full of light, he said one night, his voice almost a whisper. Even in your sorrow. It's fascinating. She found herself drawn to him, to his intelligence, his elegance, and most of all, his sadness. That profound, ancient grief Lyra had seen. One evening, her hand brushed his as he passed her a tool. His skin was not cool. It was cold. As cold as the marble fireplace, as cold as the black rose. She flinched. You're freezing. His eyes met hers. I have poor circulation. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark garden. I find I am most comfortable in the cool of the evening. The daylight is harsh. That was when the small, strange details began to stack up. He only ever met with her at night. The house was completely silent during the day, all drapes drawn. She never saw him outside. And Lyra, who now played in the library while Ilara worked, had a new name for him. The sad king is here, she would whisper. Weeks passed. Ilara's wallet was full. Her debts were a distant memory. But her fear was growing. She was a bird in a beautiful gilded cage, and she was beginning to suspect her captor was not human. The climax came on a stormy night. The wind howled. Cassian was elsewhere. Hunting, he'd said, a strange word choice. Ilara was in the library, searching for a book on 18th-century varnish. She climbed a ladder to a high, dusty alcove and found a large object covered by a dust sheet. She pulled it away. It was a massive oil-on-canvas portrait. It was a painting of Cassian. He was dressed in the formal, high-collared attire of the early 19th century, standing on the gallery of this very house. His face, his face. It was identical. The same pale skin, the same black hair, the same dark, sorrowful eyes. Ilara's blood ran cold. She looked at the small brass plaque at the bottom of the frame. Lord Cassian, 1834. A gasp, half sob, escaped her lips. This wasn't an ancestor. This was him, 150 years ago, unchanged. The cold skin, the night schedule, the impossible knowledge, the unwilting rose, the sad king. It all crashed down on her. The book on varnish slipped from her numb fingers and thudded onto the hardwood floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the vast, silent room. "A fine painting, is it not?" Ilara screamed. She spun around on the ladder, nearly falling. Cassian was standing at the threshold of the library, the shadows clinging to him like a shroud. He hadn't been there a second ago. "A distant relative," he finished, his voice a silken, terrifying whisper. His eyes were not sad now. They were fixed on her, and they were, for the first time, hungry. A man who appreciated beauty. Ilara's breath hitched, a tiny, terrified sound that was lost in the cavernous room. She was clinging to the ladder, her knuckles white, her gaze locked on the man in the doorway. The shadows seemed to move with him, to obey him, wrapping around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. The storm outside raged, and a flash of lightning illuminated the library, for one split second casting the room in stark white and black. In that flash, she saw his face, and she saw the painting. There was no difference. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard the word barely formed. It's you. 1834. Cassian didn't move. The mask of the polite, melancholy collector was gone. It hadn't just slipped. It had evaporated, burned away by her discovery. The air in the room grew heavy, cold, and charged with an ancient, terrifying power. What stood at the threshold was not a man. He took one step into the room, and Ilara flinched, pressing herself back against the dusty shelves. "You are very observant," he said. His voice was no longer velvet. It was the sound of a stone tomb sliding shut. "Just like your daughter." "What are you?" Ilara breathed, the question torn from her. It wasn't a question, really. It was a plea. "Please, don't be what I think you are." He smiled. It was a terrible, beautiful, and utterly inhuman expression. His canines, she saw with a fresh spike of icy dread, were just slightly too long, too sharp, like a wolf's. "I am a collector, as I told you," he said, his voice a low purr as he took another step. "I collect books. I collect instruments. I collect stories. And I have existed long enough to see them all written." He stopped, standing directly at the base of her ladder, forcing her to look down at him. "I am the man who has stood on the battlefields of empires you only read about. I am the shadow in the alley you tell your children to fear. I am the sad king your daughter so rightly named. I am Miss Vance, a vampire." The word hung in the air, a physical weight. Ilara's vision swam. She clutched the ladder, the world spinning. This was madness. This was a nightmare. "And yes," he continued, his voice dropping to that terrifying silken whisper, his dark eyes fixed on the pulse hammering in her throat. "I was hungry." Ilara whimpered, a small animal sound. Her hand flew to her neck. "But not," he said, a flicker of something, frustration, impatience, crossing his perfect features. "For that." He looked away from her throat, his gaze moving to the Amati violin resting on its stand. "Do you know what eternity is, Ilara? It is not a gift. It is a curse. It is an endless, gray, repetitive ocean of the same. The same greed, the same betrayals, the same petty, meaningless human lives, ending like sparks from a fire, one after another, after another. I have watched civilizations rise and fall, and the one constant is that humanity is a disappointment. He turned back to her, his face a mask of profound ancient weariness. I have everything. This house, a fortune that could buy this city, power that you cannot begin to comprehend. And I was empty, starving, for centuries. I was a king ruling over a kingdom of dust, bored with my own immortality. He walked, not to her, but to the window, staring out at the lashing rain. And then I heard it. Your music. On that cold, wet street. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. It was so pure. It was grief and loss and a desperate, clinging hope. It was light. A single, tiny candle in my endless, suffocating darkness. He turned back to her, and now the hunger was in his eyes again. But it was different. It wasn't for blood. It was for her. I watched you. I saw you with your child. I saw her look at that thing, that doll in the window. And I watched you, a mother who had nothing, who was starving, who was one day from the street, and I watched you kneel and whisper to her. You didn't lie to her. You didn't rage at the world. You told her she was the princess. You gave her everything you had. Your love. Pure, unselfish, sacrificial. A thing I thought had gone extinct. He was closer now, at the foot of the ladder again. He wasn't looming. He was pleading. I have seen 1,000 banquets, Ilara. I have tasted the rarest wines and heard the most beautiful symphonies. All of it. Dust and ashes. But that moment, at that window, that was the only thing that has made me feel alive in 200 years. That is what I was hungry for. The doll, she whispered, her hands still shaking. Was an impulse, he said, waving a dismissive hand. A trifle. The job was a pretext, an excuse. I did not want to possess your light, Ilara. I wanted to be near it. I wanted to see if it was real. I wanted to see if I, a creature of the eternal night, could stand in its warmth and not be burned. Ilara's mind was reeling. He wasn't a monster. Or he was a monster, but not the one she'd feared. He was a man, cursed with an eternity he didn't want, who had found one small, good thing in a world he'd grown to hate. Slowly, her limbs trembling, she descended the ladder. When her feet touched the floor, she was standing only a few feet from him. He was so still. He was cold, yes, but he was also lonely. The sad king. Lyra was right. You saved us, she said, her voice small. You gave me a job. You gave my daughter a home. I gave you a cage, he corrected, his voice harsh. A beautiful, gilded cage, because I was selfish. Because I am a predator, and my nature is to capture the things I desire. I am no different from the men you have known. That's not true, Ilara said, and her own voice surprised her with its sudden strength. She thought of her husband, Mark, a human man, a man who had smiled and held her and promised her forever, and then vanished, left her with a mountain of debt and a baby, leaving nothing but a note. He was human. He was the normal one, and he was the true monster. A monster of apathy, of selfishness, of cowardice. He had chosen to destroy their lives. She looked at Cassian, a vampire, a monster from a storybook, a creature who, by all rights, should have taken everything from her. And what had he done? He had seen her. He had seen her pain and her love, and he had not exploited it. He had helped. He had given Lyra her dream. He had given Ilara her dignity back, her craft, a purpose. He had paid her a fortune, yes. The act was not the point. The intent was. And in that moment, the great, terrifying lesson of her life settled over her. This was the moral. This was the education. The world teaches you to fear the dark, to fear the other, to fear the man in the dark alley or the powerful, untouchable king in his high tower. But monstrosity isn't about fangs or cold skin. It's not about being a CEO or a vampire. True monstrosity is the conscious choice to inflict pain. It's the selfishness that abandons a family. It's the apathy that walks past suffering and does nothing. And kindness. Kindness is the same. It is not about what you are. It is about what you do. A wealthy CEO, a vampire king, a single mother. They were all just people, trapped in their own worlds. Cassian had everything: immortality, power, wealth, and yet he was starving, empty in the dark. Ilara had nothing, no money, no home, no hope, and yet she possessed the one thing that could save him: a light, a humanity, a compassion that she had not allowed the world to beat out of her. Her act of love for her daughter had saved a man. His act of compassion for her had saved a god. Cassian saw the change in her face, the fear being replaced by something else: pity, understanding. He looked confused. "You should be screaming," he whispered. "You should be running." "Where would I run, Cassian?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Back to the street? Back to a world that doesn't care if we live or die? A world full of real monsters?" She stepped closer. He was cold, yes, but she didn't flinch. She reached out one trembling hand, not to his face, but to his hand, the one that had touched the Amati. She laid her warm, living fingers on his cold, marble ones. He recoiled, as if he'd been burned. "Ilara, you do not know what you are doing. You do not know what I am." "I know exactly what you are," she said, her voice firm. "You are the man who saved my daughter's birthday. You are the man who gave me back my music. You are the sad king." He was giving her a choice. The same choice he had given her at the crossroads of St. Anne. He was offering her an exit. "You can leave," he said, his voice flat, as if it were tearing him apart to say it. "I will have Malachi drive you anywhere you wish to go. You will have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You and Lyra will be safe. You will never see me again." He offered her the world, a normal life. "Or," she said, finishing his thought, "I can stay." He stared at her, his dark eyes wide, vulnerable for the first time in a century. "If you stay," he said, his voice ragged, "you must know that my world is dangerous. There are others, things far worse than me. They will hunt you, because you are my light. But I will protect you. I will protect Lyra. I will give you everything I have. And I will not let the darkness touch you." Ilara looked at this ancient, powerful, broken creature. He wasn't offering her a gilded cage. He was offering her a choice. He was offering her his protection. He was, in his own dark, twisted way, offering her his heart. She thought of the cold street. She thought of the empty, human-filled world that had abandoned her. And she looked at the monster who had saved her. "What good is a normal life?" Ilara whispered. "If you're living it alone in the dark. We were already in the dark, Cassian. You just turned on a light." She didn't run. She didn't scream. She took her other hand and placed it on his. She held his cold, strong, immortal hands in her warm, small, mortal ones. "Lyra was right," she said, a small tentative smile touching her lips. "You are a king. And a king shouldn't be sad, and he shouldn't be alone." She did not pull him into the light. She simply brought her light to him, into his darkness. and for the first time in 1,000 nights, as the storm raged outside, the Vampire King of New Orleans stood in his library, his hands held by a violin player from the streets, and he was not hungry. He was not empty. He was, finally, home. Elara would later play her violin in that vast library, the soaring, beautiful notes filling the ancient room. Lyra would sleep peacefully in her soft bed, Seraphina and the wooden nightingale side by side on her pillow. Cassian would sit in his chair, not as a collector, not as a predator, but as a man, listening. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Compassion is not a weakness. It is the only currency that matters. It is the one force strong enough to bridge the gap between a pauper and a king, between a mortal and a monster, between despair and hope. It is the light that, even in the deepest, most eternal darkness, can still, always, find a way to shine.